In our last Devo, we opened up a discussion about gaining traction in our relationship with God, and therefore in life, which is really the fruit that shows others our deep and growing relationship with our Father. Too many believers are simply spinning their wheels and never being able to move past a point where they come to. Never being able to conquer a damaging habit, never being able to enjoy friendships and whole relationships, or the stability of healthy finances, or even physical health. More importantly, many believers are just simply not confident in their God. We feel like we're standing on shifting sand. The sad result is that too many believers end up walking away, and that is an unacceptable tragedy. So what gives? We see, I believe the key to traction, to maturity, and to eventually becoming more like Messiah is obedience. But obedience to what exactly? You might say, well, obedience to the Bible. I completely agree. However, there are some 40,000 Christian denominations worldwide that all claim adherence and obedience to the Scriptures. You might say, well, let's just be obedient to Jesus. Again, I completely agree. Well, what did Jesus have to say about being obedient to Him? John 14 records Yeshua, Jesus' Hebrew name, as telling us that if we love Him, that we will keep His commandments. Let's take a look at exactly what that looks like. In Matthew 22, 36 through 40, Yeshua tells us that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, that you love your neighbor as yourself. Sadly, though, this is where many stop reading. But Jesus is not done. He goes on to say that all of the law and the prophets, or the Old Testament, the Tanakh in Hebrew, hang on these two commandments. You see, we stop right in the middle of Yeshua's explanation, but He has more to say. He brings all the law and the prophets in to this discussion to show that there's a direct connection between them and loving God and loving your neighbor. The question is, how does this work and what are the implications? Let's check out a short illustration and we'll see if we can figure it out. As an illustration, we're going to use this large metal gate that hangs on two hinges. One represents our love for God, and one represents loving our neighbor as ourselves. Now, Yeshua said that all of the law and prophets hang on those two commandments. But there's over 600 commandments in the Tanakh, not including the prophets and the writings. So before we understand how this fits together, let's take a look at the prophets. In some Christian circles, it's barely possible to spit without hitting a self-proclaimed prophet or prophetess. When most Christians are asked what idea they get when they hear the word prophet or what they understand of a prophet, the couple of most common answers are a soothsayer or a fortune teller. But is that what a biblical prophet really is? As we survey and walk through the Old Testament, we see the prophets steadily and hard at work. You see, the ancient Jewish sages said that the commandments of God, the Torah in Hebrew, which means instructions, are like a fence around God's people, providing protection and pasture and blessing and solace and peace and all those things that God has promised us. Now, if the nation of Israel became disobedient to the commandments, they basically tore down the fence and then were allowed to go out into the world where any manner of adversary was free to attack them because they were outside of God's protection. That's when a prophet would be called in. A prophet's job is to stand in the gap that was made in the fence. That's where we get that term, stand in the gap. And he would call the children of God back to obedience, back into the fence. Now, can a prophet tell the future? Well, if we read Deuteronomy 28, we see that there can only be one of two outcomes. And Deuteronomy 28 serves as the template that you'll see repeated all through the prophets. It basically says, if you're obedient to the things that I've commanded you, and you do these things, these instructions, this Torah, then blessing will overtake you. That's the promise that we want. But if you're disobedient and you tear down the fence, then the curse will overtake you. There can only be one of two outcomes. And needless to say, the lives of Jeremiah, Isaiah, Zechariah, Amos, Habakkuk are a far cry from what we see in the self-proclaimed prophets of this day. Are there prophets today? Absolutely. But they'll never speak something different to you than what the Word of God speaks to you. And the prophets of old continually called people back to obedience, back in the fence, back to obedience to the Torah. Hopefully we're starting to get a little bit better of an idea of the role of the prophet as it relates to the law and the prophets hanging on the 2 commandments that Yeshua talked about. In next week's episode of this series of Devos on being stuck, we're going to start to look at the law, the Torah in Hebrew, the instructions, and find out how this fits in with the prophets, and finally, how it hangs on the 2 greatest commandments. I pray that these Devos are strengthening you and encouraging you and causing you to a passion to look deeper into His Word, to find out His truth for yourself and take your place in the kingdom. We love you guys, and we'll see you next time.